The watchful student may have noticed a disconcerting trade-off between the two goals of pursuing low unemployment and low inflation. When aggregate demand is less than potential GDP, the economy is likely to be in a recession with unemployed workers, but at least the economy won't be experiencing any inflation. On the other side, when aggregate demand begins to bump up against or exceed potential GDP, then the economy is likely to have low unemployment, but a high rate of inflation. And of course, there's also that perfect middle ground, call it the Goldilocks economy. Not being too hot, not being too cold, just right, where aggregate demand exactly matches aggregate supply at potential GDP. But if you aren't in the Goldilocks economy, where everything is just right, we should expect to see some periods of time with high unemployment and low inflation, and other periods of time with low unemployment and high inflation. This trade-off between fighting unemployment and fighting inflation is one of the central problems of macroeconomic policy. It's known as the Phillips curve, after the economist who first provided systematic evidence for it. An economist named Alden William Housego Phillips investigated the trade-off between inflation and unemployment in the 1950s. His friends called him Bill, now we just call him Phillips. He looked at annual data on unemployment and on the percentage change in wages, which can be thought of as a measure of inflation, over a 60-year period. And when he looked at this data, he found that it yielded a distinctive relationship, which could be mathematically depicted by the Phillips curve. It takes a real discovery to have an actual curve named after you, and the Phillips curve is a worthy discovery. Here's how a Phillips curve is usually drawn now. Put unemployment on the horizontal axis and inflation on the vertical axis of a graph. Now draw a curve that slopes down from left to right and bends down rather than arching up. On a curve like this, points in the upper left are going to represent high inflation and low unemployment. Points in the lower right are going to represent low inflation and high unemployment. So it'll show the trade-off that you're getting either one or the other. High inflation, low unemployment, low inflation, high unemployment. Now, what's the economic logic for why this sort of trade-off might exist? In other words, why is it that when Phillips sat down and plotted 60 years of British historical data, did he actually trace out this line, with years of high inflation and low unemployment and other years of low unemployment and high inflation? Well, in the previous lecture, we talked about the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and that gives us an answer. When the economy is in a situation where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are meeting at potential GDP, but then aggregate demand increases still further, then you're in a situation where there's too much money, too much demand, trying to chase more than the economy can produce. And in that situation, unemployment, cyclical unemployment, is likely to be zero, and unemployment is likely to be low. However, in that situation where there's a lot of demand, there's a pretty good chance that wages are going to be bid higher by low unemployment. And in the goods market, there are going to be too many dollars chasing too few goods. So wage inflation and price inflation are likely to be happening at that time. On the other side, when the economy is in a situation where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are meeting below potential GDP, so the economy is in a recession, then the economy has unemployed labor and, in general, underemployed resources. When there's a lot of unemployment, wages are not going to be bid much higher. I mean, unemployed workers are competing for jobs. And in the goods market, with lots of extra capacity, there are likely to be lots of surpluses, which is just the opposite of too many dollars chasing too few goods. So in that situation, there's likely to be hardly any inflation resulting either. So in that kind of a situation, if you imagine the economy sort of moving into a recession and then recovering and going up into an upswing, then you can imagine that as the economy does that, it's moving from a period of high unemployment and low inflation during the recession, and then as the economy recovers, unemployment falls, but there's a risk of inflation rising. And you imagine the economy moving back and forth between these two extremes as it crisscrosses the Goldilocks economy where everything is just right in the middle. Now, after the publication of Phillips' results with British data, of course, American economists immediately began to look at U.S. data on this same phenomenon and try and plot out the points, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And when economists first started doing this in the 1960s, they plotted the data for the 1950s and the 1960s, and in a way it was extraordinarily encouraging. They got this nice, clean, clear Phillips curve, that there were some years with high unemployment and low inflation, and other years with low unemployment and high inflation, and in between there's this nice smooth curve. You can draw a nice smooth line right through them. So this was very, very encouraging. It's always nice to have an economic theory where the data seems to be backing it up. But I fear that it was maybe too good to last. In 1968, the famous economist Milton Friedman was president of the American Economic Association that year. The Economic Association is the professional organization for academic economists. Now, to the general public, Friedman is sometimes associated with his conservative or libertarian political views, but his professional work as an economist is extraordinarily good. He's certainly one of the top economists of the 20th century and has as good a claim as anyone to be the absolute top of the list. When Friedman was president of the American Economic Association, you have to give a speech when you do that, and he foretold in that speech in 1968 that the Phillips curve would not hold up in the long run. Now, his argument was deep and thoughtful along many dimensions, but in the basic terms we're using here, his argument was, in the long run, the economy reverted to potential GDP. In the long run, the economy reverted to the natural rate of unemployment. Now, the implication of that view is that in the long run, inflation might be high or inflation might be low, but unemployment will always be at about the natural rate. So instead of a situation where there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, he was effectively arguing that in the long run, there wasn't any trade-off. In the long run, there was just the natural rate of unemployment, and the only question was whether inflation would be high or low at that natural rate. Now, it's worth thinking for just a moment about the raw intellectual audacity of Friedman's claim. I mean, it is right in the face of the existing evidence, right in the face of 60 years of British data and decades of U.S. data. It is right in the face of the existing economic theory. It is right in the face of the main professional consensus of that time. And Friedman was right. Just a few years later, the relationship between unemployment and inflation that had prevailed through the 1950s and 1960s essentially collapsed. Remember, the Phillips curve predicts a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. As one goes up, the other goes down. But if you look at a graph of data on U.S. unemployment and inflation for the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, that is not what you see. Instead, the points are all over the map. In the 1970s, both inflation and unemployment go up at the same time. Remember, these are the years of what was sometimes called stagflation, and inflation and unemployment both nearly hit double digits. In the 1980s, then, both inflation and unemployment go back down, which doesn't seem to say there's a trade-off between the two. And then in the late 1990s, both inflation and unemployment were both even lower than they had been in the mid-1980s. So what happened to that Phillips curve trade-off? How can we explain that a Phillips curve that fit the U.S. data for the 1950s and 60s suddenly stopped fitting that data in the 1970s? Or how can we explain why it fit 60 years of British data for Phillips and then suddenly went away? It's a disconcerting intellectual problem. The answer that economists have developed is that this trade-off between inflation and unemployment, this downward sloping Phillips curve, might be a short-run phenomena. A short-run phenomena that lasts over a few economic cycles of recession and recovery. Remember, the whole argument for the underpinning of the Phillips curve was about how an economy moves in and out of recession and recovery. But in the long run, this sort of economic cycles and the cyclical unemployment would come and go and come and go. And the underlying level of the natural rate of unemployment would remain. So you might hit that natural rate in the long run at a somewhat higher or lower rate of inflation. Let's say, for example, that the natural rate of unemployment is roughly 5.5%, although it's probably sometimes a little higher or a little lower. It's not a fixed constant. And let me just give you some data for a few years to give you a sense of why we might believe that. In 1963, for example, the unemployment rate that year was 5.7%, and the economy had 2.5% inflation. In 1972, the unemployment rate was 5.6%, and the economy had 4.4% inflation, double the rate in 63. In 1974, the unemployment rate was 5.6%, and the economy had 11% inflation, much higher than either of the first 2 years. In 1990, the unemployment rate was 5.5%, and the economy had 5.4% inflation. In 1994, the unemployment rate was 5.6%, and the economy had 2.5% inflation. And in 2004, the unemployment rate was 5.5%, and the inflation rate was 2.7%. Now, the point of that list of numbers is that in all of those years, the unemployment rate was essentially 5.5, 5.6, 5.7%. So over the long run, the economy seemed to keep going back toward this natural rate of unemployment of about 5.5%. But the inflation rate was wildly different between those different years. In some years, the inflation rate was very low, low single digits. In other cases, the inflation rate was very high, even up to double digits. So if you were saying, is there a trade-off between unemployment and inflation? Well, in the long run, there doesn't seem to be much of a trade-off at all. In the long run, it seems like the unemployment rate is just essentially a vertical relationship. It's a straight line on the Phillips curve. And you can imagine that on this straight line at 5.5% unemployment, you can either have a high rate of inflation, a medium rate of inflation, or a low rate of inflation. But there's no trade-off. You don't get lower unemployment if you make inflation higher. You don't change unemployment at all, depending on whether unemployment is higher or lower. So, in the short run, the argument is, as the economy goes back and forth past the potential GDP, you're going to get a situation where in the short run you get recessions, you get economic booms, and in that situation over a period of 5 or 6 years, or if the economy doesn't change too much, then you're in a situation where you'll get this Phillips curve trade-off, where inflation and unemployment will trade off against each other. But in the long run, over several decades, it's not clear you get that trade-off anymore. Instead, you get a fixed rate of unemployment over the long run. The economy keeps adjusting back to that fixed rate, and inflation, higher inflation, is just a negative. Now, higher inflation doesn't buy you anything. It doesn't buy you lower unemployment. There's no counterbalancing trade-off. Now, which of these views is more useful? Should we think about which view, the sort of original view, the Phillips curve, or should we think about the Friedman view? Well, the different views of this unemployment-inflation trade-off help to illustrate the major difference of opinion in modern macroeconomics. And this major difference of opinion was introduced in the previous lecture. It's a difference of opinion between the neoclassical economists who take the Say's law position that supply creates its own demand as their sort of basic point of departure for modeling the macroeconomy. And on the other side, there are Keynesian economists who take Keynes' law that demand creates its own supply as their main point of departure for thinking about the macroeconomy. So let's think about how those two schools of thought think about the unemployment-inflation trade-off. Keynesian economists would emphasize that the macroeconomy is subject to a failure to coordinate aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Remember that aggregate supply is growing slowly and steadily over time, but aggregate demand is fluctuating somewhat more. And so aggregate demand isn't always matching aggregate supply at potential output. The Keynesian economists fear that because the macroeconomy is inherently unstable, components of aggregate demand like investment and consumption are moving up and down all the time. Keynes in particular referred to how investment was affected by what he called animal spirits. that it either seemed like a really good time to invest or a really terrible time to invest. And that those animal spirits were not necessarily subject to any kind of careful calculation. Now, if you add to these animal spirits of business sentiment and consumer sentiment the reality of sticky wages and sticky prices that we also talked about in the previous lecture, then with sticky wages and prices, both labor and product markets may not adjust prices, they might not adjust to the equilibrium very quickly. There are going to be situations where price doesn't move to equilibrium right away, where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, where you have unemployment for a time, where you have surpluses of goods for a time. And if you combine these two factors of aggregate demand bouncing up and down with animal spirits and prices being somewhat slow to adjust, then the economy is often going to find itself sort of either headed into a recession or zooming out of a recession. From a Keynesian view, the economy is unstable in that way. So the Keynesian argument is that if you just leave the macroeconomy alone in response to these kinds of disturbances, it can get stuck. It can get stuck below, say, the potential GDP level of output. It can get stuck in recession. It can even get stuck in depression for a long, long time. A key insight of Keynesian economic analysis might ask, for example, if we're in the long run, things always go back to potential GDP, well, what were the natural economic factors that were supposed to end the Great Depression? You know, is the real argument here, you neoclassical economists, is the real argument that the Great Depression would have just gone away if we just waited for a while? Sure didn't seem like it was going away. Well, the argument here would be that if there's hardly any demand in the economy, then over time, wages should fall, prices should fall. Eventually, at lower wages, it'll be worth hiring more workers. As prices fall and existing plant and equipment becomes very cheap, someone will buy it and run it, and eventually the economy will restart itself. But during the Great Depression, the price level fell by 1/3 over a period of 4 years. And, who knows? Maybe some natural process would have corrected this in the long run, but as Keynes famously wrote, in the long run, we're all dead. It doesn't help to wait for the long run sometimes. Or to put his point a little more softly, people have lives to lead. And if it takes the economy several years to readjust, several years to get back, that's a huge chunk out of people's lives and careers. So, Keynesian economists, coming from this perspective, tend to support active government macroeconomic policies to fight unemployment, to stimulate the economy, and to try and make recessions or depressions as short as we possibly can. What about neoclassical economists on the other side? Neoclassical economists tend to emphasize that the economy does adjust toward potential GDP over time. They believe that the modern macroeconomy, leaving aside maybe stuff that happened in the 19th century or even the Great Depression, is fairly stable. Neoclassicals emphasize that the historical record, like the data I gave you a little bit ago, suggests over recent decades the macroeconomy does tend to return to potential GDP. It does tend to return to this 5.5% rate of unemployment over time. Every few years it gets back there. Sure, neoclassical economists would say the Great Depression was a terrible event, but it was also at some level an extraordinary event, when a whole bunch of things went wrong all at the same time, both in terms of the economy and in terms of policy. And, they would argue, it doesn't make sense to generalize from that particular experience to macroeconomics in the 21st century. After all, over the decades, markets have become more developed. Recessions in the last 20 years have tended to be less violent than the Great Depression, certainly. And in many cases, like, say, the 2001 recession, neoclassicals would argue that the recession may have been a case of the economy trying to adapt to new technology. In the late 1990s, there's this rush of new technology and new investment. Then, 2001, the economy becomes somewhat overextended, firms back off. Their animal spirits tell them not to invest. Now, neoclassicals might argue that might not be an ideal way for the economy to proceed, where everyone rushes into a market and then they all rush out and there's a recession and then they rush back in again. But remember, In the long term, the big issue is economic growth. In the long term, the big issue is to get this new technology in place. And that may not be a perfectly smooth process, but that's not a reason to think the economy is malfunctioning in some systematic or deep way. Neoclassicals also fear that if the government actively intervenes in macroeconomic policy, it's at least as likely to do harm as good. Neoclassical economists are the type of people who tell that old joke. What are 3 things you should never believe? 1, the check is in the mail. 2, of course I'll respect you in the morning. And 3, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. They fear that when the government talks about helping the macroeconomy, it's essentially planning to ignore the real limits of potential GDP. It's trying to say, we're just going to punch up aggregate demand, we're just going to goose aggregate demand, and we're just going to push it as hard as we can, and the government is going to push the economy into inflation. Neoclassical economists would often prefer to see government macroeconomic policy conducted with clear rules that are specified well in advance, to constrain government discretion, and also so that markets can take those rules into account. Neoclassical economists believe in fighting inflation fiercely, because from a long-run perspective, inflation provides no reduction in employment nor any other economic benefit. Now, I shouldn't give you the sense that Keynesian and neoclassical economists totally disagree on everything. Both Keynesians and neoclassicals believe in the natural rate of unemployment. Both are very open to considering whether redesign of the institutions that affect incentives to hire and to work might help reduce the natural rate of unemployment. However, it's also fair to say that the sorts of people who are Keynesians often are more likely to emphasize how government could help the unemployed with active programs like job search and retraining, or temporary support for unemployment insurance and health insurance. Whereas neoclassicals are likely to emphasize that you might reduce the natural rate of unemployment by helping get rid of rules and regulations that discourage businesses from hiring, or rules that mandate that if firms hire workers, they need to provide certain benefits, or getting rid of rules that limit the hours firms can be open or the locations where they can build new plants. Now, in theory, of course, all of these play into the natural rate of unemployment. They can all affect incentives to work or incentives to hire. But it does tend to be true among economists, as with everyone else, that people with differing political views will emphasize different political agendas. Now, although Keynesians tend to focus more on unemployment than on inflation, and neoclassicals tend to focus more on inflation than on unemployment, both schools of thought argue that their particular focus would improve prospects for long-term economic growth. On the neoclassical side, what's the argument for how low inflation could improve economic growth? Well, low inflation clearly lays a better groundwork for making long-term plans for investment. I mean, at the very least, economic actors are not distracted by a fear that inflation might undermine their plans. Remember, the great productivity slowdown of the early 1970s happened at about the same time as the great inflation of the 1970s. And the productivity growth didn't return until inflation had been thoroughly beaten for a time. So there's at least some argument there that inflation and a low inflation environment provides a good context for economic growth. But on the other side, Keynesians would argue that lower unemployment also helps economic growth. After all, employment itself is a form of investment in experience and human capital, which should support long-term economic growth. A standard approach to measuring human capital looks at years of education and years of work experience. Unemployment means millions upon millions of workers are missing work experience. And that means that the human capital of these workers, one of the main contributors to economic growth, is being reduced. When people are unemployed and they have to switch jobs repeatedly, or be retrained repeatedly, or have big gaps in their lifetime work profile, this has large and real costs, not just to workers in the present, but also to the accumulated experience of the workforce, in a way that can make the entire workforce somewhat less productive over time. So both schools of thought would argue that their particular emphasis is important for long-run growth. Now, although the Keynesian and neoclassical schools do conflict on a number of points, they also agree on several points. For example, they agree that there is no necessary conflict between the view that over the long run of several decades, economic growth is what matters, but over the short run of 3 to 5 years, a country should seek to minimize the extremes of economic cycles to the event possible, and avoid either high unemployment or high inflation. Both sides also recognize that at least some of the disagreements between Keynesian and neoclassical economists are perhaps not as much a matter of economic insight as they are political judgments about the effectiveness of government and the extent to which certain macroeconomic goals should be more important or less important. For example, should the economy focus more on reducing unemployment? Should it focus more on keeping inflation low? Should it focus more on long-term economic growth? If you put different weights on those kinds of goals, you might come up with different policies that you would prefer to pursue. Also, both of these schools of macroeconomics fundamentally use the basic framework of aggregate supply and aggregate demand to argue their case and to support their case. Now, there are a lot of jokes about how economists disagree. It's said that if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, they wouldn't reach a conclusion. Did you hear about the game of Trivial Pursuit for economists? It has 500 questions, but 5,000 answers. Now, in these lectures, I'm certainly agreeing with the obvious point that economists do disagree sometimes. But I'm also pointing out that the disagreement of economists is based on a common analytical framework and a common set of tools and concepts that allows them to specify what their agreement and disagreement is really all about. Let me quote to you from a well-known current macroeconomist named Bennett T. McCallum. McCallum said, "I would like to argue that it is wrong to claim, as many commentators have, that the present state of macroeconomic understanding is very bad. It is true that many wildly divergent modeling strategies appear in current research papers, and that a wide variety of policy ideas are being put forth for consideration. But much of the apparent disagreement results, I believe, from the process of personal competition among the growing population of research economists. In the United States," McCallum continues, "there are hundreds of capable and ambitious assistant professors who need to win tenure to publish about a dozen articles in which, quote, originality, end quote, is supposed to be demonstrated. But mature and thoughtful members of the profession, even members whose articles feature very different models, will nevertheless take quite similar positions on most of the truly fundamental issues." And as an example of a fundamental issue, McCallum says, "Would sustained inflation lead to faster growth over extended periods of time?" The point being that essentially no economist believes that faster inflation is a good route to rapid economic growth. Robert Solow, the Nobel laureate in economics in 1987 and one of the truly fine writers in the profession, described this dual approach of thinking about a long-run neoclassical approach determined by long-run growth and a short-run recession-fighting approach in these terms. This is quoting Solow. Solow said, "At short time scales, I think, something sort of Keynesian is a good approximation, and certainly better than anything straight neoclassical. At very long time scales, the interesting questions are best studied in a neoclassical framework, and attention to the Keynesian side of things would be a minor distraction. At the 5 to 10 year time scale, we have to piece things together as best we can and look for a hybrid model that will do the job." Sometimes I think about modern macroeconomics as riding two horses, like a circus acrobat. One foot's on the neoclassical horse, one foot's on the Keynesian horse, and what happens in between the horses is not altogether clear. But remember, the subject of economics is not about getting a certain predetermined set of answers. So this disjunction between neoclassical and Keynesian economics isn't something that should make you crazy. Both of these are useful frameworks for thinking about economic problems that arise in the short run and the long run. And so by building both Keynesian and neoclassical understanding on a framework of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, we have a flexible and useful framework that we can use to understand and analyze the key questions of macroeconomics.